There are moments in history when truth is spoken plainly, and there are moments when it is performed. This book begins with a simple but unsettling proposition. What if much of what has shaped belief, loyalty, and authority was never merely taught, but staged? What if the line between faith and theater has not always been clear, and was never meant to be? From the earliest chapters of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits emerged not only as theologians and educators, but as masters of something far more subtle: perception. They understood a principle that still governs the modern world. People rarely believe what they are told, but they almost always believe what they see, what they feel, and what they experience. So they did not rely on argument alone. They built stages, they crafted spectacles, they turned doctrine into drama, and belief into something that could be absorbed through emotion before it was ever examined by reason. As you will hear in the chapters that follow, this was not accidental. It was deliberate, it was structured, it was refined over centuries into a system capable of shaping entire populations. Not through force alone, but through immersion. In theaters, audiences watched saints rise and sinners fall, heaven blaze with glory, and hell erupt in terror. In courtrooms, the accused stood surrounded by symbols that seemed to carry the weight of eternity. In churches, statues moved, wept, and bled, whether by miracle, mechanism, or something in between. Each scene carried the same underlying message: authority is sacred, resistance is dangerous, and what you are witnessing is not merely human, it is divine. But was it? This book does not ask you to reject faith. It asks you to examine the methods by which faith has been presented, reinforced, and at times engineered. Because once you begin to see the pattern, it does not remain confined to the past. The same principles that shaped medieval audiences, spectacle, emotion, fear, awe, and narrative control, did not disappear. They evolved, they migrated, they reappeared in new forms, new institutions, and new technologies. The stage expanded, the audience grew, the methods became more refined. What began in candlelit theaters and sacred chambers now echoes through modern media, film, and the global systems that shape how societies think, react, and believe. This is not simply a history of the Jesuits. It is a study of influence itself. It is an examination of how authority can be constructed, how belief can be guided, and how reality, or at least the perception of it, can be shaped through carefully designed experience. Some of what you will hear is drawn from documented history. Some arises from patterns, interpretations, and questions that remain contested. Not every claim will sit comfortably. Not every conclusion will be universally accepted. But the purpose here is not to settle every debate. It is to expose the framework, the machinery behind the stage. Because once you understand the mechanics of the performance, you begin to see it everywhere. You begin to recognize when emotion is being directed. You begin to question when authority feels too absolute, too theatrical, too carefully framed. You begin to ask a dangerous question, one that echoes through every chapter of this work. How much of what we call truth has been revealed, and how much has been presented? The pages that follow are not simply a narrative. They are an invitation to observe more closely, to listen more carefully, and to reconsider the possibility that history itself has, at times, been a production. And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer what was believed. It is who wrote the script. Chapter 1. The Theatre of Control. Jesuit Drama as a Tool of Influence. The Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits, mastered the art of influence through education, rhetoric, and theatrical spectacle. Their theater was never mere entertainment. It was a calculated instrument of persuasion, designed to shape minds, reinforce Catholic doctrine, and resist the spread of Protestant ideas during the Counter-Reformation. By combining religious narrative with dramatic intensity, Jesuit theater became a form of psychological conditioning, drawing audiences into performances that left a deep and lasting imprint on their faith, emotions, and worldview. The Jesuits understood that doctrine alone was not always enough to move a population. Ideas had to be embodied, dramatized, and made emotionally unforgettable. In an age where large portions of the population were illiterate or only semi-literate, theater became an extraordinarily powerful medium. A sermon could be forgotten, a book might never be read, but a vivid scene of divine judgment, a saint's triumph, or a sinner's destruction could remain fixed in the mind for years. This was where Jesuit genius revealed itself. They did not merely argue for belief. They staged it. They made it visible, emotional, and difficult to resist. Jesuit theater was highly structured and deeply didactic. Its purpose was not simply to amuse, but to convert, instruct, and discipline. The plays revolved around biblical narratives, the lives of saints, and moral allegories involving sin, redemption, obedience, and divine justice. Again and again, the central message was made unmistakable: salvation lay within the Catholic Church, and those who strayed from its authority moved toward error, ruin, and eternal punishment. The stage became an extension of the catechism, but one with far greater emotional force. It was doctrine not merely spoken, but embodied in conflict, suffering, reward, and terror. This gave Jesuit drama an explicitly political and religious function in the struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism. The theater became a battlefield in a wider war over souls, authority, and social order. Protestant ideas, which the Church regarded as dangerous and heretical, were subtly or openly demonized. Characters who embodied Protestant impulses, questioning doctrine, appealing to private judgment, seeking independent interpretation of Scripture, or resisting ecclesiastical authority, were often shown descending into despair, confusion, rebellion, punishment, or damnation. The emotional logic was simple and effective. To depart from Rome was not portrayed as an intellectual disagreement. It was presented as a spiritual catastrophe. Through dramatic moral contrasts, audiences were taught to associate dissent with disorder and obedience with safety. This moral dramatization was especially powerful because it reached people not through an abstract theological debate, but through emotion, imagery, and fear. A semi-literate audience did not need to master doctrinal distinctions to understand what it meant to see a rebellious figure ruined and a faithful servant rewarded. The contrast itself taught the lesson. Jesuit theater translated complex religious conflict into emotional theater the masses could immediately grasp. In this sense, it was not just performance, it was mass persuasion. The productions themselves were often grand, sophisticated, and visually overwhelming. Jesuit theater rivaled the pageantry of royal courts, employing elaborate costumes, complex stage machinery, moving scenery, lighting effects, music, and dramatic visual devices. The aim was to create an atmosphere of awe in which the spiritual world seemed to break into the physical one. Audiences were shown celestial apparitions, infernal visions, levitations, moving statues, and scenes in which the boundary between heaven, earth, and hell appeared momentarily suspended. These were not random embellishments. They were carefully calculated devices designed to intensify the audience's emotional experience and reinforce the spiritual claims being presented. When a statue of the Virgin Mary appeared to weep at a decisive moment, or when a sinner's soul seemed to be dragged into hell through smoke, darkness, and hidden stage mechanisms, the effect was powerful. These scenes did more than entertain. They made doctrine feel immediate and visible. They gave the audience the impression that they were not merely watching a play, but glimpsing divine intervention itself. The line between theater and reality became deliberately blurred. What should have been recognized as stagecraft could instead be absorbed as evidence of spiritual truth. In that confusion lay much of the method's power. Part of this effect was achieved through automata and other mechanical devices. Figures capable of nodding, gesturing, moving, or appearing to bleed were used to intensify the sense of wonder. To modern eyes, these may seem like primitive special effects, but in their historical setting, they could be overwhelming. Many viewers did not understand the mechanisms involved and could easily interpret such marvels as miraculous rather than theatrical. The result was to reinforce the impression of a world in which God, the saints, and the Church were visibly active, responsive, and omnipresent. The spectacle itself became a proof of authority. This theatrical strategy had a double effect. It captivated the audience while also discouraging skepticism. In an era when scientific explanations were limited, when sacred authority was deeply embedded in social life, and when the Church still commanded immense reverence, visual spectacle could achieve what direct argument could not. It could bypass rational resistance and act directly on the emotions. The viewer who was terrified, awed, or deeply moved did not stand at a cool distance evaluating propositions. He was caught up in an experience. The performance entered the imagination before the mind had time to resist it. This is why Jesuit theater functioned as a true psychological weapon. Its power lay not only in what it said, but in what it made people feel. By placing glorious visions of heaven beside horrifying depictions of hell, the plays compelled audiences to internalize Catholic doctrine through emotional contrast. Salvation was not presented as an abstract theological proposition. It was shown in beauty, light, order, and triumph. Damnation was shown in terror, chaos, smoke, fire, and despair. Such images had immense force, especially among those who were unlikely to engage in formal theological discourse. The emotions did the teaching, the spectacle completed the argument. Fear and awe were therefore not side effects of Jesuit drama. They were central to its design. The performances ensured that the Church's message remained in the memory long after the audience left. A terrifying vision of punishment or a glorious image of reward could haunt or guide a conscience far more effectively than doctrinal exposition alone. In this way, Jesuit theater shaped not just public understanding, but moral reflexes. It trained people to associate obedience with safety and dissent with destruction. The Jesuits' skill in theatrical persuasion did not remain confined to the stage. The same instincts, methods, and understanding of human psychology carried over into other domains of religious authority, including trials, public discipline, and the wider machinery of ecclesiastical power. The transition from stage to courtroom was not as great as it may seem. In both settings, symbols, props, emotional rhetoric, sacred imagery, and carefully choreographed performance could be used to control perception and direct outcomes. Religious trials, especially those associated with the Inquisition, often bore a distinctly theatrical character. The accused heretic did not simply stand before a neutral legal mechanism. He entered a setting saturated with symbolism, clerical authority, and emotional pressure. Religious imagery, sacred objects, and charged rhetoric transformed the proceedings into a spectacle in which faith and law were fused. Some accounts and later allegations even suggest that staged wonders, a bleeding crucifix, a moving relic, or other dramatic manifestations, were used or at least believed to occur in order to reinforce the guilt of the accused and the righteousness of the tribunal. Whether every such report was genuine, exaggerated, or fabricated, the logic behind them is entirely consistent with the methods already perfected in Jesuit theatrical culture. Such spectacles served several purposes at once. They reaffirmed the visible power and supposed righteousness of the Church. They intensified the emotional burden on the accused. They warned observers of the consequences of dissent. Above all, they created an atmosphere in which opposition to ecclesiastical authority appeared not merely rebellious, but spiritually doomed. Under such pressure, the accused could be broken psychologically, and the public could be taught a lesson more effectively than by punishment alone. The point was not only to condemn one person. It was to reinforce the entire structure of Catholic supremacy in the minds of all who watched. Jesuit theater then was never just about drama. It was about control, through powerful storytelling, emotional manipulation, visual spectacle, and at times the suggestion of supernatural intervention. The Society of Jesus reinforced doctrine in forms that were difficult for ordinary people to resist. The audience did not simply hear the Church's message. They experienced it with their senses, absorbed it with their emotions, and carried it away in memory. The techniques developed in Jesuit religious drama did not vanish with the end of the Counter-Reformation. They laid foundations for later forms of propaganda, political theater, and modern methods of mass persuasion. Even now, the same basic principles remain visible across media, politics, and religious messaging. Capture attention, stir emotion, shape moral interpretation, and leave the audience feeling that what they have witnessed is not merely compelling, but true. The enduring legacy of Jesuit dramatic persuasion lies precisely here. It reveals how easily the line between belief and illusion can be managed by those who understand staging, symbolism, and the psychology of the crowd. When spectacle is joined to authority, people do not merely watch, they submit. And when they submit emotionally, before they think critically, the performance has already done its work. Chapter 2. Sacred Deception, Religious Iconography in Theatrics and Trials. The courtroom of the Inquisition was never merely a place of legal judgment. It was a carefully constructed stage of intimidation, a setting in which law, religion, and fear were fused into a single instrument of control. The accused did not stand before an impartial tribunal weighing evidence in a neutral spirit. They stood before a body cloaked in the appearance of divine authority, surrounded by symbols designed to crush resistance before any sentence was spoken. In that setting, religious iconography, sacred relics, and alleged signs of supernatural favor or wrath were not innocent expressions of devotion. They were tools of persuasion, pressure, and psychological domination. The accused was meant to feel not simply judged by men, but exposed before God Himself, or at least before a system claiming to speak in His name. The architecture and presentation of Inquisition trials were deliberately arranged to overwhelm the senses and impress upon the defendant the supposed omnipresence of divine judgment. Crucifixes, images of saints, relics, vestments, candles, and sacred objects were displayed not as passive ornaments, but as instruments of emotional coercion. The very environment communicated that resistance was futile, not only because the Church held earthly power, but because heaven itself was presumed to stand behind the proceedings. To enter such a chamber was to enter a world where legal accusation and spiritual condemnation had been merged into one. Those placed on trial were often made to swear oaths before crucifixes or relics, thereby reinforcing the terror that any denial, hesitation, or contradiction might not merely offend the court, but invite divine wrath. In some cases, the accused were compelled to kneel before the relics of martyrs or saints, as though their very destiny hung upon these objects. This was no small detail. It transformed the legal process into a ritual drama of submission. By forcing the accused into bodily acts of reverence under the gaze of clerics and sacred imagery, the tribunal made fear itself part of the procedure. The pressure was not only intellectual, it was spiritual, emotional, and physical. Beyond sacred symbolism, the wider medieval and early modern religious world also made use of ordeals, trials by fire, water, or painful tests presented as forms of divine judgment. The underlying claim was simple and terrifying. God would reveal guilt or innocence through the outcome. In such a framework, the verdict no longer appeared to be the product of fallible human beings. It appeared sanctified, even when it rested on brutality, superstition, or manipulation. Human intervention vanished behind the language of providence. The accused was not merely confronting interrogators. He or she was trapped in a system that declared its own conclusions to be endorsed by heaven. Throughout the history of religious spectacle, stories circulated of statues that moved, nodded, wept, or otherwise reacted in moments of crisis. Reports emerged in various settings of figures of Christ or the saints appearing to respond to prayer, approve the righteous, or condemn the impious. In a culture saturated with reverence for sacred images, such phenomena could have an overwhelming effect. A subtle movement in a charged setting could be enough to alter a crowd's emotional state and fix the meaning of an event in the minds of all who witnessed it. Once the people believed heaven had spoken through an image, argument became almost impossible. One possible mechanism behind such wonders was the use of automata, mechanical figures rigged with pulleys, hidden levers, concealed compartments, or unseen human operators. These devices were known in religious culture and in later Jesuit theater, where carefully staged illusions could make statues appear to gesture, move, or react. During the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits became especially famous for their dramatic productions, which used theatrical effects to move audiences emotionally and reinforce doctrinal lessons. Statues could appear to weep. Sacred figures could seem to come alive. Religious dialogue could be paired with stagecraft so persuasive that the illusion of supernatural presence became nearly irresistible. In such a context, it is not difficult to imagine similar techniques being used in judicial or quasi-judicial settings where the outcome needed to favor church authority. The power of such devices did not rest merely in the mechanism itself. Their force came from the emotional climate into which they were inserted. A frightened defendant, surrounded by clerics, incense, relics, and sacred imagery, would be especially vulnerable to suggestion. If a crucifix seemed to move, or a saint's image appeared to incline toward condemnation, the effect could be devastating. It would not simply impress the crowd, it could break the accused internally, leaving him convinced that resistance was not only useless, but impious. That is how spectacle becomes a weapon. It does not need to prove anything rationally. It only needs to shape perception at the decisive moment. The same issue arises in the long history of bleeding and crying statues. Numerous accounts describe sacred images that allegedly shed tears or blood, often in moments of great tension or controversy. Such occurrences were typically interpreted as signs of divine intervention, favor, sorrow, or wrath. One well-known example is Our Lady of Leon in 1566, where a statue was reported to have shed tears. To the faithful, such a sign could powerfully confirm that heaven was watching, responding, and rendering judgment. In a trial atmosphere, a phenomenon like this would have immense persuasive force. A public already disposed to believe in miraculous signs could easily interpret such an event as confirmation of guilt, innocence, or divine displeasure. Yet many supposed miracles of this kind were later challenged or exposed as fabrications. Investigations in different cases uncovered hidden tubes, animal blood, cleverly placed fluids, or substances that reacted to temperature and moisture in ways that produced the appearance of tears or bleeding. Whether every such case was fraudulent is another question, but the documented existence of such tricks makes suspicion unavoidable. If these manipulations were used in religious settings to stir devotion, attract pilgrims, or increase reverence, it is entirely reasonable to ask whether similar tactics could have been deployed in judicial settings to intensify the pressure upon the accused. Even where definitive proof is lacking in a specific trial, the precedent is deeply unsettling. If sacred spectacle could be manufactured for one purpose, it could be manufactured for another. One of the clearest historical examples of religious intimidation in a trial is the case of Joan of Arc in 1431. No mechanical miracles were reported in her courtroom, yet the atmosphere of the proceedings was saturated with religious symbolism and clerical authority. Joan was not interrogated by detached legal minds seeking simple factual clarity. She faced churchmen determined to cast her visions not as divine, but as demonic or delusional. She was surrounded by those who claimed the power to interpret heaven while presenting themselves as its rightful guardians. In such a setting, every answer she gave carried spiritual danger. This created a trap from which there was no easy escape. If Joan insisted that her voices and visions came from God, she risked being condemned as a false prophet or a spiritually deceived woman daring to claim direct authority from heaven. If she admitted error or deception, she would effectively condemn herself as a heretic and a perjurer. The trial was therefore not a neutral search for truth. It was a form of psychological warfare, structured so that the accused could be spiritually broken, regardless of how she responded. The religious setting amplified this pressure at every turn. The symbols surrounding her did not offer comfort. They served to remind her that her judges claimed not only institutional power, but sacred legitimacy. Another persistent legend associated with religious trials is that of the nodding crucifix, a crucifix whose figure of Christ would move its head in answer to questions, either affirming innocence or confirming guilt. No direct historical proof establishes that such a device was used in an actual trial. Yet the story has endured because it fits so naturally within a world already familiar with automated sacred figures and choreographed religious wonders. The legend survives, not because it has been conclusively demonstrated, but because it expresses a deeper truth about the culture of the time. People knew that sacred images could be used to direct belief, settle disputes, and overwhelm doubt. In a world where relics moved, statues wept, and miracles were staged before reverent crowds, the idea of a crucifix made to nod in judgment does not feel alien. It feels like an extension of an already established method. Whether every tale of moving icons and miraculous responses is true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, the underlying mechanism of power remains clear. The Church understood that the human mind could be deeply influenced when placed in an atmosphere saturated with sacred symbolism. Fear and reverence are powerful forces on their own. Joined together, they can become nearly irresistible. Once the courtroom is transformed into a sacred theater, the accused no longer stands in a simple legal contest. He stands inside a world where every object, every gesture, every image, and every ritual seems to testify against him. In that environment, faith itself could be turned into a weapon. Sacred relics, enforced oaths, manipulated images, and alleged miracles created a battlefield of the mind in which the verdict could be shaped long before formal judgment was pronounced. Even when no mechanical trick was used, the structure of the proceedings relied on the emotional force of religious authority. The symbols were doing work. They were producing submission, heightening terror, and strengthening the impression that the accused was resisting not merely a tribunal, but heaven's own decree. The full extent of fraudulent theatrics in judicial settings may never be known. The record is incomplete, and much has been lost, concealed, or softened by time. Yet what is known is already enough to establish a dangerous precedent. Religious deception did occur. Sacred spectacle was used to influence the faithful. Mechanical or staged wonders were real enough in other contexts to make their possible use in trials a deeply serious question. That means divine judgment could, at times, be fabricated or, at the very least, theatrically reinforced in ways that made resistance seem spiritually impossible. The Jesuits, especially during the Counter-Reformation, became masters of dramatic persuasion, showing how performance, symbol, and emotional manipulation could be joined into a potent instrument of control. Whether on a stage, in a church, or in a chamber of judgment, the principle was the same: captivate the audience, direct their emotions, and leave them believing exactly what authority wished them to believe. Chapter 3: The Jesuits and the Art of Deception. From mechanical miracles to modern manipulation, the Jesuits have long been accused of operating in the shadowy space where faith, illusion, and control intersect. From the grand theatrical culture of the Counter-Reformation to later accusations of political and religious manipulation, their reputation has been bound to the art of shaping perception. More than many other religious orders, they have been associated with the calculated use of spectacle, psychology, symbolism, and narrative power. To admirers, this has appeared as intelligence, discipline, and strategic brilliance. To critics, it has looked like something darker: a system skilled in presenting appearance as truth, performance as sincerity, and managed belief as genuine conviction. Although the Catholic Church has never formally admitted to a pattern of fraudulent miracles, history contains many cases in which revered relics, sacred objects, and alleged divine manifestations were later challenged, exposed, or heavily questioned as products of human design. In some cases, hidden mechanisms were discovered. In others, chemical alteration, staged presentation, or manipulation of public expectation created the illusion of supernatural intervention. Whether or not every such case can be laid directly at the feet of the Jesuits, the wider religious culture in which they operated made use of methods that blurred the distinction between devotion and engineering. The result was a powerful fusion of piety and stagecraft, one capable of strengthening belief, attracting wealth, consolidating authority, and directing the imagination of entire populations. Religious deception was not unique to the Jesuits, but their strategic use of spectacle, illusion, and propaganda has often made them stand apart in the historical imagination. Throughout the centuries, the faithful have been drawn to relics and artifacts said to carry divine power. Such objects promised contact with heaven, confirmation of doctrine, and visible evidence that the sacred had entered the material world. Yet, again and again, these objects have been surrounded by controversy, exposure, or suspicion. What was presented as miraculous was sometimes revealed to be mechanical. What inspired tears and offerings was at times bound up with methods designed to create awe rather than truth. One of the most famous examples was the Rood of Grace at Boxley Abbey in England. Pilgrims believed this crucifix moved, nodded, and responded to prayers as though animated by divine power. The impression was one of supernatural life within a sacred object, and it drew devotion and offerings from believers who regarded it as miraculous. Yet during the English Reformation in 1538, Protestant reformers dismantled the crucifix and reported the discovery of hidden mechanical devices inside it, allegedly operated by priests. What worshippers had taken as a sign from heaven was exposed as a contrivance of wood, leverage, and human manipulation. The miracle had not descended from above. It had been manufactured below. Its purpose was not merely spiritual edification, but the reinforcement of religious authority and the drawing in of financial support. Another striking case was the Holy Blood of Wilsnack in Germany. After a church fire in 1383, 3 consecrated hosts were said to have been found marked with blood. This transformed the church into a major pilgrimage center. Believers traveled in large numbers to witness what they considered a divine sign, and the phenomenon generated enormous prestige and material benefit. Yet the miracle did not remain, beyond question, forever. In 1558, a church investigation reportedly concluded that the hosts had been artificially treated to create the appearance of blood. If so, the deception had endured for nearly 2 centuries, operating successfully across generations. Here again, the pattern is revealing. A spectacle clothed in sanctity became a source of influence, devotion, and wealth, all sustained by the public's willingness to trust what was placed before its eyes. No discussion of controversial relics can avoid the Shroud of Turin, perhaps the most famous disputed artifact in the Christian world. This linen cloth bearing the image of a crucified man has been revered by millions as the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. For many believers, it functions as a direct visual link to the Passion itself. Yet the shroud has also been the subject of intense scientific scrutiny and unending controversy. The most widely cited challenge came in 1988 when radiocarbon dating suggested a medieval origin, placing the cloth between 1260 and 1390 AD. That result fueled the argument that the shroud emerged during a period when relic forging was common, and religious demand for tangible sacred objects was immense. The Vatican has not declared it a hoax, and debate continues, but the very intensity of the dispute reveals a deeper issue. Relics are not only spiritual objects. They are also instruments of emotional power, public attention, and institutional authority. They direct devotion, and devotion directs loyalty. Among the strangest stories associated with Catholic hidden knowledge is the tale of the chronovisor, a supposed device said to view past events. The story centered on Father Pellegrino Maria Arinetti, a Benedictine monk rather than a Jesuit, yet the legend became entangled with long-standing ideas about Jesuit secrecy, hidden archives, and control over history. According to the claim, the device allowed its operators to witness past moments, including the crucifixion of Christ. No physical evidence for such a machine has ever emerged, and scholars generally dismiss it as a hoax or fantasy. Yet the story survives because it resonates with a larger perception that powerful clerical networks, especially those associated in the public mind with the Jesuits, possess concealed knowledge and manipulate what the world is allowed to know. The legend flourishes not because it has been proven, but because it fits an existing image of hidden power cloaked in sacred authority. The issue does not end with relics, crucifixes, and miracle tales. The accusation extends beyond the fabrication of sacred objects into the shaping of narratives, institutions, and even global events. The Jesuits have long been admired and feared for their skill in education, diplomacy, rhetoric, infiltration, and influence over rulers. These same qualities that made them formidable missionaries also made them, in the eyes of critics, masters of psychological and political theater. They understood that power can be exercised not only through force, but through framing. To define the meaning of an event is often more important than to cause the event itself. Whoever controls interpretation controls reaction. Whoever controls reaction begins to control history. This suspicion is especially strong in discussions of Vatican II, the council held between 1962 and 1965, that dramatically altered the tone, language, and posture of the modern Catholic Church. For many observers, Vatican II marked a revolutionary transformation. The Church emerged with a new emphasis on ecumenism, dialogue with the modern world, softened rhetoric, and a more open posture toward other faiths and contemporary social realities. To supporters, this was renewal. To critics, especially traditionalist Catholics, it looked like a carefully staged rebranding. In that interpretation, the Jesuits played a major role in framing the shift as spiritually necessary and historically inevitable. The concern was not merely that reforms occurred, but that the need for them was dramatized and managed in such a way that resistance could be painted as backwardness. while change could be clothed in the language of inspiration and progress. The transformation in this view did not appear as blunt revolution. It appeared as guided revelation. From there, the suspicion widens into the modern political sphere. Some researchers and theorists argue that the Jesuits have influenced the rise of contemporary social justice movements, not as sincere engines of compassion alone, but as tools for directing social and political energy into managed channels. They point to the order's long history of operating within governments, universities, media spheres, and intellectual institutions, and claim that the Jesuits excel at shaping moral narratives from behind the scenes. In this reading, the language of justice, equality, and reform can become a method of centralizing moral authority and expanding ideological control. Mainstream historians usually reject such claims as conspiracy theory, yet the reason the argument persists is that the historical record does show the Jesuits repeatedly entering places of influence, shaping educational and political discourse, and adapting themselves to the dominant struggles of each age. Their genius has never been rigidity. It has been strategic adaptation in pursuit of lasting power. Their genius has never been rigidity. It has been strategic adaptation in pursuit of lasting power. This is why the Jesuits remain such a controversial force in history. They are associated not merely with doctrine, but with performance, persuasion, and public spectacle. They understood that human beings are governed not by argument alone, but by what they see, feel, fear, and revere. A mechanical crucifix can move a crowd more effectively than a theological lecture. A bleeding host can bind devotion more tightly than a sermon. A reform movement framed as moral necessity can transform an institution more deeply than open coercion. The skill lies in making the constructed appear spontaneous, the managed appear sacred, and the strategic appear providential. From medieval relics to modern politics, the recurring issue is not simply whether one miracle was false or one narrative was manipulated. The deeper issue is the enduring power of staged reality. Once people can be led through spectacle, symbolism, and emotional conditioning, control no longer needs to announce itself openly. It can operate through images, rituals, crises, and carefully managed interpretation. The line between truth and theater becomes difficult to see. That is where the real power lies. The enduring question, then, is not merely whether deception has been used, but how often entire structures of belief and authority have depended upon it. How much of what people have accepted as sacred truth was genuinely divine, and how much was shaped by human hands skilled in illusion, narrative, and control. If the masters of performance understand that public belief can be engineered through what people witness and emotionally absorb, then history itself becomes vulnerable to staging. And when history can be staged, those who shape the performance do more than deceive. They begin to govern what entire generations are willing to call reality. Chapter 4: Hollywood and the Jesuit Agenda. Shaping Faith Through Film. Hollywood is more than an entertainment industry. It is a powerful instrument for shaping culture, influencing thought, and constructing narratives that determine how audiences understand history, religion, and morality. What appears on the screen does not remain on the screen. It enters the public imagination, affects moral assumptions, and gradually conditions entire societies to see certain institutions, beliefs, and power structures in a particular light. Among the many ideological forces that have moved through Hollywood, the Jesuits stand out as one of the most strategic and persistent. Through connections to media institutions, through the education and formation of influential filmmakers, and through their long-standing ability to shape intellectual and cultural discourse, the Jesuits have often been accused of embedding their philosophy, values, and worldview into cinematic storytelling. Sometimes this appears in an open and direct way, with Jesuits portrayed as heroic, sacrificial, and morally elevated figures. At other times it appears indirectly, through themes that align with Jesuit methods and assumptions. Disciplined elites, guiding events behind the scenes, strategic compromise in hostile environments, intellectual engagement with moral ambiguity, and spiritual warfare waged through highly trained agents. Whether by direct depiction or philosophical echo, Hollywood has often functioned as a powerful amplifier for Jesuit-friendly narratives. Some films place the Jesuits directly at the center of the story, presenting them in a way that shapes public perception of their historical role. One of the clearest examples is Silence from 2016, directed by Martin Scorsese, himself a former student of a Jesuit school. The film follows two Jesuit missionaries who travel to 17th-century Japan, where Christianity has been outlawed, and where they face brutal persecution and agonizing moral dilemmas. The story presents the Jesuits as men of intense conviction, intellectual seriousness, and extraordinary endurance. Their willingness to suffer, to wrestle with silence from heaven, and to persist in a hostile land gives them an almost sacred heroism. The film also highlights the Jesuit capacity for adaptation, showing how they move within foreign cultures, navigate hostile systems, and seek to preserve influence even under conditions of severe danger. For some critics, this mirrors the Jesuit doctrine of strategic compromise, the ability to bend outwardly without surrendering inwardly, to adapt externally while keeping core commitments intact. Though the film is filled with moral ambiguity, it still leaves behind a strong impression of Jesuits as misunderstood defenders of faith, victims of persecution rather than agents of deeper religious or political strategy. A similar pattern appears in The Mission, from 1986, directed by Roland Joffé. Set in 18th-century South America, the film tells the story of Jesuit missionaries seeking to protect indigenous people from the brutality of Spanish and Portuguese colonial power. The emotional force of the film comes from its presentation of the Jesuits as defenders of the weak, protectors of the vulnerable, and martyrs for justice. They are shown as standing against exploitation rather than participating in systems of domination. Their political power is softened in the telling, while their benevolence is pushed to the foreground. The viewer is encouraged to see them not as imperial managers, but as righteous men caught in the machinery of worldly corruption. Critics, however, have argued that this is a deeply selective portrait. While Jesuits did at times oppose the harsher abuses of colonial authorities, they also operated the Jesuit reductions, extensive settlements in which indigenous populations were subjected to firm religious and social control. Those complexities are largely omitted. The result is a cinematic narrative that sanctifies Jesuit involvement, portraying them as almost entirely noble while sidestepping the controlling dimensions of their historical presence. Beyond films that depict Jesuits directly, there are many others in which Jesuit-style themes and structures appear more indirectly. In these cases, Hollywood does not need to show the order itself. It simply reproduces elements of the Jesuit worldview in symbolic form. One of the most frequently cited examples is the Star Wars franchise. The Jedi Order has often been compared to the Jesuit Order, and the comparison is not difficult to understand. Both are portrayed as highly trained elites, formed through discipline, mental control, moral instruction, and strategic influence. The Jedi are philosophical warriors. They operate as a distinct order, separate from ordinary society, yet deeply involved in politics, conflict, and the direction of history. They are not merely soldiers, they are guardians, interpreters, mediators, and covert influencers. In this sense, they resemble the old Jesuit ideal of an intellectually armed order, able to move close to power while claiming allegiance to a higher cause. The Jedi undertake covert missions, navigate royal and political structures, and intervene in the fate of entire civilizations from behind the scenes. Though Star Wars is a secular science fiction epic, its imaginative architecture, closely parallels themes long associated with Jesuit strategy and formation. Another important film in this discussion is The Exorcist from 1973. Here, the connection is more overtly religious. One of the central priestly figures is Jesuit trained, associated with Georgetown University, a prominent Jesuit institution. The film did more than terrify audiences. It helped restore public interest in exorcism, demonic possession, and the idea of direct supernatural conflict between good and evil. In doing so, it reinforced traditional Catholic spiritual categories at a time when secularism was rising and the supernatural was increasingly dismissed. The Jesuit-associated priest is presented as a figure of seriousness, depth, and spiritual authority, someone capable of confronting radical evil at its source. This is significant because the Jesuits have long cultivated an image of themselves as warriors in the realm of spirit, defenders against heresy, corruption, and dark forces. The film's success strengthened that image. It did not merely tell a story about possession. It re-legitimized the Catholic model of spiritual warfare, placing Jesuit authority within the center of that drama. Then there is The Da Vinci Code from 2006, a film that, at first glance, seems hostile to the institutional church. Yet some observers argue that even controversy can serve deeper Catholic or Jesuit interests when it drives public fascination with religious mystery, Vatican history, suppressed documents, and hidden theological questions. The film trades heavily on secrecy, coded knowledge, forbidden history, and the allure of what lies behind official doctrine. Although it presents church-related institutions in a suspicious light, it also succeeds in drawing global attention back toward Catholicism, sacred symbols, church history, and religious intrigue. The result is not disengagement from religion, but intensified curiosity about it. This, too, resembles a familiar Jesuit intellectual method. The Jesuits have often operated through provocation, debate, paradox, and engagement with controversial subjects, using intellectual tension as a way to pull the mind into deeper inquiry. In that sense, even a film framed as a challenge to Catholic narratives can still function within a Jesuit pattern of strategic provocation. The audience begins with skepticism, but is drawn into fascination. Across these examples, a pattern emerges. Hollywood repeatedly returns to images of disciplined religious elites, intellectual warriors, sacrificial missionaries, and morally complex spiritual agents who move within hostile worlds without fully belonging to them. The stories often glorify adaptability, strategic influence, spiritual authority, and the ability to shape events from behind the visible structure of power. These are not incidental themes. They reflect traits long cultivated within the Jesuit imagination itself. This does not require every director, writer, or producer formed in a Jesuit institution to be acting under a conscious program. Influence does not always move through explicit command. Often it moves through formation, habit, admiration, intellectual inheritance, and narrative instinct. A filmmaker educated within a certain tradition may reproduce its assumptions without ever announcing them. Over time, those assumptions become part of the cultural bloodstream. They are repeated, refined, and absorbed into mainstream storytelling until they appear natural. What makes this important is not simply that Jesuits are shown favorably in some films. It is that cinema has the power to canonize institutions, recast controversial histories, and build emotional loyalty to ideas that might otherwise be questioned. A 2-hour film can do what 100 academic arguments cannot. It can make an audience feel admiration before it begins to think critically. It can present a selective moral universe in which one order, one worldview, or one style of power is bathed in nobility, sacrifice, mystery, and purpose. Through both direct representation and indirect philosophical alignment, Many films have reinforced Jesuit narratives of morality, discipline, strategy, and influence. Silence and the Mission present Jesuits as noble and persecuted defenders of the vulnerable. Star Wars reflects the structure of a disciplined order shaping history from behind the scenes. The Exorcist restores gravity to Catholic spiritual warfare and places Jesuit-trained authority at the center of the battle. Even the Da Vinci Code, though controversial and centered more visibly on Opus Dei, can be read as serving broader Catholic interests by provoking global engagement with religious themes, church secrets, and theological mystery. By embedding Jesuit-friendly narratives into mass entertainment, Hollywood helps preserve and extend the cultural reach of Jesuit history, ideals, and methods. The result is that Jesuit influence does not remain confined to seminaries, universities, or ecclesiastical institutions. It becomes woven into the emotional and symbolic fabric of popular culture, where millions absorb its themes without ever consciously naming the source. Chapter 5: Hollywood and the Jesuit Vision: Shaping Society Through Social Messaging. Hollywood is more than a film industry. It is a vast cultural engine, with the power to shape values, mold beliefs, and direct public opinion across nations and generations. For decades, critics, researchers, and independent observers have argued that Hollywood's messaging has not merely reflected social change, but has often guided it. Beneath the glamour, spectacle, and emotional storytelling lies a quieter pattern: the steady promotion of themes that closely resemble Jesuit philosophy, especially in the areas of social justice, interfaith dialogue, global unity, and the subordination of the individual to a wider collective purpose. What once appeared to be entertainment alone increasingly reveals itself as a vehicle for ideological formation. At the center of this pattern is the Jesuit principle of enculturation. Rather than imposing ideas through blunt force or overt religious domination, enculturation works by entering a culture, learning its language, adapting to its symbols, and gradually embedding a worldview from within. It does not shout, it settles in. It reshapes imagination before it reshapes law. It normalizes assumptions before it announces conclusions. This is what gives it power. In the Jesuit missionary model, a people need not be conquered militarily if their cultural instincts can be redirected. The message is adapted to existing habits, moral sentiments, and artistic forms until the ideology appears natural, inevitable, and even desirable. This same principle can be seen in the workings of Hollywood. Rarely does the industry introduce sweeping ideological changes all at once. Instead, it presents them gradually through emotional narrative, sympathetic characters, heroic sacrifice, and recurring moral frameworks. New values are not usually presented as propaganda. They are woven into stories. They are attached to compelling images, noble causes, wounded outsiders, and urgent crises. In this way, entertainment becomes a kind of catechism, not of old religion, but of a new moral order. Viewers are not told they are being taught. They are simply invited to feel, to identify, to absorb, and eventually to accept. The parallel becomes even clearer when one considers the transformation that took place within the Jesuit order after Vatican II. Once known for disciplined scholarship, aggressive apologetics, and the defense of Catholic doctrine, the Jesuits increasingly turned away from the old language of repentance, salvation, and faith in Christ, and toward a new mission centered on social justice activism. The modern Jesuit agenda has come to revolve around climate change, economic equality, racial justice, migration, and interfaith cooperation. The shift is profound. The emphasis moved from saving souls to reorganizing society. The mission ceased to be primarily spiritual and became increasingly political, cultural, and global. This is why some critics describe social justice as the Jesuits' new gospel. The language of Christianity may remain, but the center of gravity has changed. The new message is not chiefly about redemption from sin, but about activism, systems, structures, and collective transformation. Rather than calling the world to Christ, it seeks to reorganize the world according to a moral vision that is compatible with global institutions, NGOs, policy networks, and secular humanitarian language. In this environment, Hollywood functions as a remarkably effective amplifier. It takes the moral assumptions of this new order and gives them emotional life, aesthetic force, and mass appeal. One of the clearest areas where this alignment appears is in the treatment of social justice and forms of liberationist ideology. The Jesuits have long cultivated an image as defenders of the oppressed, champions of the marginalized, and advocates of structural change. Hollywood repeatedly elevates this same framework. Activists, revolutionaries, and dissidents against established power are often cast as moral heroes whose struggle represents a broader fight for historical justice. Films such as Black Panther and Judas and the Black Messiah are not merely stories about individuals. They are stories about systems, liberation, and the moral urgency of social transformation. The recurring pattern is unmistakable. The audience is trained to see history through the lens of oppressor and oppressed, and to regard revolutionary change as a moral necessity. Another recurring theme is interfaith dialogue and the soft erasure of theological boundaries. Jesuit thought has long emphasized ecumenism, accommodation, and the reduction of hard doctrinal barriers between faiths. Hollywood mirrors this tendency by presenting religion less as a matter of truth and error, and more as a shared symbolic language through which all spiritual paths ultimately converge. Films such as Life of Pi and The Shack encourage viewers to see truth as distributed across traditions, rather than revealed in any exclusive or binding form. The message is subtle but powerful. Doctrinal distinctiveness is divisive, while spiritual inclusivity is enlightened. In this framework, theological conviction becomes a problem to be softened, and universal religious harmony becomes the higher good. Closely linked to this is Hollywood's frequent promotion of global unity at the expense of rooted identity. The Jesuit tradition has long been international in scope, often favoring broad transnational vision over narrow national loyalty. Hollywood, in many of its major franchises and prestige films, repeatedly portrays nationalism, inherited tradition, and fixed identity as obstacles to progress, peace, or survival. The future belongs to fluid identity, borderless solidarity, and universal belonging. The X-Men franchise offers one clear example of this impulse. Mutants serve as a metaphor for a world in which old distinctions are destabilized, and a new, universal order must emerge. Race, religion, nationality, and inherited social forms are treated not as anchors, but as outdated barriers to a more enlightened, collective future. Perhaps the most revealing pattern of all is Hollywood's fixation on humanity uniting against a common enemy or global catastrophe. Again and again, audiences are shown worlds in which survival depends upon the suspension of old divisions. National sovereignty becomes secondary. Religious differences fade. Local authority collapses. In its place emerges the necessity of collective management, global coordination, and some form of centralized authority. The emotional lesson is repeated so often that it begins to function as moral conditioning. When the crisis is large enough, traditional freedoms and structures must give way. This theme appears throughout major disaster and existential threat films. In Independence Day, the world unites under a single military effort to face an alien invasion. In The Day After Tomorrow, climate catastrophe forces leaders toward coordinated global action. In 2012, national structures are bypassed in favor of elite international crisis management. In Greenland, Extinction-level danger is met with militarized coordination that implies survival depends on submission to higher authorities. In San Andreas, disaster collapses conventional systems and places emphasis on emergency-level collective response. The narrative pattern is consistent. Crisis becomes the justification for new forms of authority. The same logic extends into pandemic and apocalyptic films. In World War Z, humanity's response to a global outbreak depends not on the independence of nations, but on centralized international systems. In Don't Look Up, political division and national fragmentation are mocked as childish obstacles to a unified response to existential danger. The deeper message is not difficult to discern. Global problems require global governance. National resistance appears selfish. Independent judgment appears dangerous. Centralization begins to feel not only practical, but moral. This is especially significant in the realm of climate change and environmental storytelling. The Jesuits, along with the wider Vatican apparatus, under figures such as Pope Francis, have strongly promoted climate policy, not merely as a technical issue, but as a moral imperative. Environmentalism is framed as a spiritual duty, and global policy solutions are elevated above the political and economic autonomy of individual nations. Hollywood has played a major role in preparing the public imagination for this way of thinking. By repeatedly portraying climate disasters, ecological collapse, and planetary emergency as problems that demand international intervention, the film industry has habituated audiences to the idea that supranational control, resource management, and limits on sovereignty may be both necessary and virtuous. Some films go even further, moving from environmental concern into a kind of eco-spirituality. In these stories, nature is not simply a created world to be stewarded responsibly. It becomes mystical, sacred, reactive, and morally superior to humanity. Human beings are portrayed not merely as sinners in the biblical sense, but as violators of the planet itself, needing to atone for ecological transgression. Avatar is one of the clearest examples, presenting nature as spiritually infused and corporate exploitation as a desecration. Fern Gully teaches children to view environmental destruction through a deeply moralized lens. Moana reinforces reverence for natural forces in ways that lean away from biblical categories and toward pantheistic themes. Outside Hollywood proper, films such as Princess Mononoke and Okja similarly present nature as something near divine and humanity as a species needing moral correction through ecological submission. In this atmosphere, environmentalism is no longer merely about conservation. It becomes quasi-religious. It acquires ritual language, moral absolutes, and a framework of guilt and redemption. This is why critics see a striking alignment between such narratives and Laudato Si', where care for the environment is elevated into a profound moral and spiritual cause. The movement is no longer simply political. It has the structure of belief, sin, and atonement. Beneath many of these narratives lies another deeply important Jesuit concept, the common good. In theory, the common good can sound noble, even necessary. No society can function without some concern for shared welfare. But in practice, the phrase can become a mechanism for subordinating individual freedom to elite management. It can be used to justify the erosion of liberty in the name of social order, moral necessity, or collective survival. This is where Hollywood's moral storytelling again becomes significant. Over and over, audiences are taught that the highest virtue is not personal freedom, but self-sacrifice for the system, submission for the collective, and moral conformity to a larger social purpose. Avengers: Endgame offers a vivid example. The emotional core of the story turns on the surrender of personal life for universal preservation. Iron Man's sacrifice is framed as the highest form of moral action. The audience is invited to admire the surrender of the individual for the sake of the collective. Similar patterns appear in Interstellar, where personal attachment must yield to species survival, and in The Dark Knight, where deception and manipulation are presented as acceptable if they serve a larger social good. Even The Hunger Games, despite its surface resistance to tyranny, ultimately operates within a framework where compromise with broader structures remains central to the resolution. Across these narratives, selflessness is repeatedly defined not as obedience to God or principled moral conviction, but as surrender to an overarching societal necessity. This has a profound effect on public imagination. It trains people to see liberty as negotiable, conscience as secondary, and centralized moral management as compassionate rather than coercive. The individual becomes meaningful chiefly through service to a larger whole. Personal rights are no longer sacred in themselves. They are conditional, suspended whenever a sufficiently large cause is invoked. In this way, Hollywood does more than entertain. It rehearses the moral emotions needed for the acceptance of a more managed world. In earlier centuries, the Jesuits used theater, art, ritual, and dramatic spectacle to shape imagination and guide public morality. They understood that stories can move where sermons cannot, and that emotion can accomplish what argument alone often fails to achieve. That same principle survives in modern form through the cinema. The stage has become the screen, the audience has become global, and the moral formation is now transmitted through streaming platforms, blockbuster franchises, awards culture, and celebrity influence. The medium has changed, but the method remains familiar: shape the imagination, and the worldview will follow. Through enculturation, social messaging, interfaith themes, environmental spirituality, and the repeated exaltation of the common good over individual liberty, Hollywood has increasingly functioned as a kind of modern pulpit for ideas that closely parallel the Jesuit social vision. Whether consciously or unconsciously, the industry has helped normalize a worldview in which national distinctions are softened, theological boundaries are blurred, activism becomes sacred, and collective authority is treated as morally necessary in the face of crisis. Some films still resist these patterns. Not every story serves the same ideological current. Yet the broader trend remains difficult to ignore. Again and again, the dominant moral architecture of mainstream cinema aligns with themes long cultivated by the Jesuit tradition: unity over division, collective purpose over individual liberty, global consciousness over national identity, and managed moral order over independent conviction. The deeper question, then, does not disappear. It only grows sharper. Is Hollywood merely reflecting cultural change, or is it helping to engineer it? And if it is helping to engineer it, to what extent does that influence trace back to a long historical tradition, skilled in shaping public imagination, moral sentiment, and social direction from behind the curtain? Chapter 6. Pope Francis, Green Sabbath. A modern bait and switch? Pope Francis has not officially declared a Green Sabbath, but his advocacy for environmental stewardship closely aligns with the idea of a designated rest day for the planet. In his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, he called for a deep reflection on humanity's impact on the environment, urging individuals and nations to embrace measures that protect the Earth. The notion of setting aside a specific day for environmental mindfulness appears well-intentioned, but it raises significant theological, economic, and historical concerns. Most people in the modern world work, engage in commerce, or participate in leisure activities for at least 6 days a week. A mandatory Green Sabbath, if enforced on Sunday, would disproportionately impact those who observe a different sacred day, particularly Sabbath-keeping Christians, Jews, and Muslims. For Seventh-day Sabbatarians and Jews, who already refrain from work on Saturday, a Sunday rest requirement would essentially force them to keep 2 rest days per week. Meanwhile, Catholics and Sunday-keeping Protestants would only need to observe one rest day, giving them a clear employment and economic advantage over those adhering to the biblical Sabbath. A dual rest requirement would place undue hardship on business owners, employees, and individuals whose religious convictions already dictate a Sabbath observance on Saturday. It is evident that the concept of a green Sabbath, though framed as an environmental initiative, would most naturally align with Sunday observance, even if this is not stated explicitly. Directly naming Sunday as the designated day would likely provoke immediate theological and political resistance, as it would expose the underlying religious implications embedded within what is presented as a neutral, global policy. The Roman Catholic Church has a long-established history of transferring Sabbath observance from Saturday to Sunday, a shift grounded not in Scripture, but in ecclesiastical authority and reinforced through tradition, narrative, and institutional power. This pattern reflects a broader strategy in which external justification is used to support an already established religious structure. In the modern era, this approach finds a parallel in the environmental framework advanced under Pope Francis, whose emphasis on climate responsibility and moral obligation toward the earth elevated ecological concerns to a global ethical priority. Although Pope Francis has now passed away, the movement he helped energize continues to operate, extending beyond his lifetime through institutions, policy discussions, and cultural influence. The mechanism of persuasion has shifted from overt religious enforcement to global environmental urgency, appealing not only to believers, but to governments, corporations, and secular societies. Within this structure, the idea of a universal rest day can be advanced under the language of sustainability and collective responsibility, while remaining functionally aligned with Sunday, rather than the biblical seventh-day Sabbath. Religious observance and the growing pressure for a universal rest day. The seventh-day Sabbath is deeply rooted in biblical tradition and continues to be observed by Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, the Church of God, Seventh-day, Messianic Jews, and various Hebrew roots movements. These groups maintain that the true Sabbath, instituted at creation and affirmed in the Ten Commandments, falls on Saturday, not Sunday. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church uniquely observes both Saturday and Sunday, preserving an ancient tradition of Sabbath reverence. Islam, while not having a full Sabbath rest, designates Friday, Jumu'ah, as the most sacred day of the week. Muslims are required to attend midday congregational prayers, but they are permitted to work before and after prayer. The Quran, 62:9-10, instructs believers to pause their work temporarily for worship, but unlike the biblical Sabbath, it does not impose a full day of rest. Most of Christendom, following Roman Catholic tradition, observes Sunday instead of Saturday. This shift, initiated by the early Catholic Church, was not rooted in Scripture, but in church authority. The push for a green Sabbath further intensifies the Sunday versus Saturday debate, raising concerns that under the pretext of environmental responsibility, a universal rest day may eventually be enforced on Sunday rather than the biblical Sabbath. The implications extend beyond theology. If Sunday laws or global rest mandates gain traction, the economic burden will fall heaviest on Sabbath keepers, who would be expected to refrain from work twice a week, effectively limiting their employment opportunities and financial security. Meanwhile, Catholics and Sunday-keeping Protestants would enjoy the privilege of a single, designated rest day, avoiding the same restrictions. This scenario raises ethical questions. Is the Green Sabbath a sincere, environmental effort, or is it another attempt to enforce Sunday observance by appealing to secular concerns? The historical precedent of Sabbath replacement suggests that the Vatican has long sought to universalize Sunday worship, and the environmental movement provides a modern rationale to advance this agenda. While environmental sustainability is a legitimate concern, forcing a universal Sunday rest day places undue hardship on those who uphold a Saturday Sabbath. A truly inclusive approach would allow individuals the freedom to observe their own sacred rest day without economic penalty or state-imposed mandates. If the Green Sabbath is about freedom and sustainability, then it must also respect the freedom of religious observance, including those who honor the biblical seventh-day Sabbath. Sunday is not the biblical Sabbath, a historical fraud. The seventh-day Sabbath observed on Saturday is established in Genesis 2:3 and codified in the fourth commandment, Exodus 28:11, as the appointed day of rest set apart by God. This foundation places the sanctity of the Sabbath within creation itself, preceding all later religious institutions and traditions. Despite this, the Roman Catholic Church has historically asserted the authority to transfer the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, not through explicit biblical mandate, but through ecclesiastical authority and institutional development. This shift represents a redefinition of sacred time that rests not on Scripture, but on the claimed authority of the Church to interpret, modify, and enforce religious practice. This position has not been hidden. Historical Catholic sources openly acknowledge the change and frame it as evidence of institutional authority over Scripture. Statements such as, "Sunday is our mark of authority," "The Church is above the Bible," and this transference of Sabbath observance is proof of that fact. And you may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday reflect an internal recognition that Sunday observance is not derived from the biblical text itself, but from the authority structure of the Church. In this context, the transition from Saturday to Sunday becomes not merely a matter of tradition, but a demonstration of institutional power over religious doctrine. In the modern era, the framing of Sunday rest can take on new forms, particularly when aligned with broader social or global concerns. When environmental responsibility is introduced as a moral imperative, the idea of a designated day of rest for the planet can be presented as both ethical and necessary. Within such a framework, a Sunday-based rest model can be advanced without explicit theological argument, instead appealing to shared global concerns, sustainability, and collective responsibility. The result is a convergence in which a historically religious practice is reinforced through secular justification, allowing it to operate across both religious and non-religious contexts. Alongside these developments, modern media plays a significant role in shaping how audiences understand the concept of rest, order, and social balance. Films and television series frequently depict societies in which scheduled pauses, regulated cycles, or mandatory resets are necessary to maintain stability. Productions such as The Purge, The Giver, and Westworld present controlled systems where human behavior is structured around imposed intervals of release, rest, or recalibration. International works like 3% and Dark reinforce similar patterns, portraying cyclical time and structured systems as essential to fairness, balance, or cosmic order. Through repetition, these narratives normalize the idea that periodic interruption of normal life is not only acceptable, but necessary for the functioning of society. A further layer of influence appears in films that frame environmental responsibility and human behavior within a spiritual or moral context, elevating the concept of rest from practical necessity to sacred obligation. In Noah, environmental preservation is presented as a divinely mandated responsibility, linking ecological care to spiritual duty. Mother portrays the earth as something violated by human action, reinforcing a narrative of ecological guilt and the need for moral correction. Eternals introduces overarching forces guiding human history, suggesting that higher authority structures shape the trajectory of civilization. In visually driven works, such as Baraka and Samsara, nature is depicted as sacred and harmonious, while industrial activity is framed as disruptive and destructive, encouraging a perspective in which humanity must restrain itself in order to restore balance. The sacrifice centers on the idea that radical personal sacrifice may be required to avert catastrophe, reinforcing the legitimacy of extreme measures in times of crisis. Across these narratives, a consistent pattern emerges in which rest, restraint, and withdrawal from normal activity are associated with moral responsibility, collective survival, and alignment with a higher order. The viewer is gradually conditioned to accept that structured pauses, whether framed as environmental necessity, social stability, or spiritual duty, are both reasonable and desirable. Within such a framework, the concept of a universal rest day becomes increasingly normalized, not as an imposed religious command, but as a logical response to global conditions. Through the convergence of historical precedent, institutional authority, and modern media conditioning, a worldview takes shape in which global unity, centralized coordination, and collective compliance are presented as the necessary response to existential challenges. In this environment, the idea of a shared day of rest, aligned with prevailing cultural norms and reinforced by both moral narrative and practical justification, emerges as a natural extension of the broader system of thought shaping contemporary society. United Nations and Climate Summit, messaging in media, environmental narratives, and the conditioning of global consciousness. Beyond traditional cinema, the influence of global environmental narratives has been reinforced through documentaries, news media, and large-scale productions aligned with themes promoted in international forums such as the United Nations and global climate summits. These productions do not merely inform, they shape perception by presenting climate change as an urgent, universal crisis requiring immediate and coordinated human response. Through repetition, emotional framing, and selective emphasis, they establish a worldview in which environmental responsibility is elevated from a policy concern to a moral imperative that transcends national, cultural, and religious boundaries. Documentaries such as An Inconvenient Truth, presented by Al Gore, frame climate change in terms of immediacy, crisis, and moral duty, normalizing the idea that radical intervention is both justified and necessary. Similarly, Before the Flood, featuring Leonardo DiCaprio, advocates for structured, policy-driven environmental action, reinforcing the notion that governance must expand to address planetary concerns. Productions such as Seaspiracy and Cowspiracy go further by portraying industrial systems as fundamentally destructive, encouraging a form of collective guilt and behavioral correction, where humanity is positioned as responsible for environmental degradation and therefore obligated to change its patterns of consumption, production, and daily life. Through these narratives, environmentalism is not simply discussed. It is moralized, becoming a framework through which human behavior is judged and regulated. This messaging does not operate in isolation. It aligns with broader cultural patterns already present in film and television, where global crises, collective survival, and unified responses are repeatedly portrayed as necessary for the continuation of human civilization. Climate disaster films reinforce the urgency of immediate action, while narratives depicting nature's retaliation against humanity present the Earth itself as something approaching a sacred entity, deserving reverence and protection. At the same time, stories built around scheduled resets, societal pauses, and mandatory compliance normalize the idea that human activity may need to be periodically halted for the sake of balance, stability, or survival. When combined with spiritual or moral language, these themes gradually condition audiences to see environmental stewardship not only as practical policy, but as a moral obligation that could justify structured, recurring limits on human activity. Within this framework, The concept of a universal environmental rest day becomes increasingly plausible at the level of public imagination. Even where no single production explicitly advocates such a policy, the cumulative narrative effect is to make global coordination, mandatory restraint, and collective behavioral alignment appear both rational and necessary. The integration of scientific authority, moral urgency, and visual storytelling creates a powerful synthesis in which environmental action is framed as both logically unavoidable and ethically required, preparing the ground for broader forms of coordinated regulation. This modern pattern can be compared, at a structural level, to earlier historical developments in which shifts in religious practice were reinforced through narrative, tradition, and claims of authority. In early Christianity, the biblical Sabbath, observed from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, was widely recognized among both Jewish and Gentile believers. Over time, however, Sunday observance emerged within the Roman context, influenced by cultural, political, and religious factors that gradually repositioned the first day of the week as the dominant day of worship. This process was not instantaneous, but cumulative. It involved gradual shifts in practice, authority, and public perception that eventually resulted in the widespread adoption of Sunday as the primary day of rest within Western Christianity. By the time of Emperor Constantine's decree, in the year 321, Sunday had been formally established as a civil day of rest within the Roman Empire, reinforcing its religious significance through state authority. In subsequent centuries, particularly during the era of Pope Gregory I, Sunday observance became deeply entrenched within the Roman Church, even as some communities continued to observe the seventh-day Sabbath. This transition was supported not only by institutional authority, but also by narratives, traditions, and accounts that reinforced the sanctity of Sunday and discouraged alternative practices. Stories of divine approval, punishment, and miraculous confirmation circulated widely among the population, shaping belief and reinforcing compliance through both fear and reverence. In historical terms, such narratives functioned as mechanisms of persuasion and legitimization, aligning religious practice with institutional authority. In the modern context, the role once played by miracle narratives is, in some respects, mirrored by the use of scientific consensus, environmental urgency, and global crisis framing. Where earlier societies were influenced through claims of supernatural validation, contemporary audiences are influenced through appeals to data, expert authority, and planetary risk, all of which carry their own form of persuasive power. The language has changed, but the structural function remains the same, shaping belief, guiding behavior, and aligning populations with a broader framework of authority. In this environment, environmental messaging can exert moral pressure, framing resistance to proposed solutions as irresponsible, uninformed, or ethically deficient. It can also support policy development, encouraging governments and institutions to adopt measures that regulate human activity in the name of sustainability. Over time, what begins as voluntary awareness can evolve into normalized expectation, and from there, into institutional practice, particularly when supported by both cultural narratives and international policy frameworks. Within this broader pattern, the intersection of environmental urgency, media reinforcement, and historical precedent creates a context in which large-scale behavioral alignment becomes conceivable. The same mechanisms that once shaped religious observance, through narrative, authority, and repetition, now operate through media systems, global institutions, and cultural production. These systems influence how societies interpret obligation, responsibility, and the acceptable limits of individual freedom. In relation to collective goals, Hollywood's hidden hand, how film and television normalize Sunday. Over the biblical Sabbath, Hollywood and mainstream television have played a major role in shaping public assumptions about time, worship, rest, and religious normalcy. One of the most effective ways this has occurred is not through direct theological argument, but through repetition, imagery, and cultural conditioning. Across decades of film and television, Sunday is repeatedly presented as the natural day of church-going, reflection, family gathering, moral pause, and communal rest. Meanwhile, the biblical Sabbath, which falls on Saturday, is either ignored, blurred, or quietly displaced. The cumulative effect is powerful. Viewers are not usually told outright that Sunday has replaced the Sabbath, yet they are trained to assume it. In this way, entertainment media reinforces a long-established religious and cultural pattern, in which Sunday observance is normalized, and the seventh-day Sabbath is pushed to the margins of public consciousness. A number of films present Sunday as a sacred or morally elevated day, without ever clarifying that the fourth commandment refers to the seventh day, not the first. In Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell's refusal to run on Sunday is portrayed as a noble act of conviction. But the story leaves the viewer with the impression that Sunday is the true Lord's day, rather than confronting the biblical question of whether the sanctified day is, in fact, Saturday. Films such as The Ten Commandments, despite drawing heavily on biblical material, do not forcefully correct the widespread confusion over the Sabbath, allowing popular assumptions about Sunday worship to remain intact. The Passion of the Christ, shaped by a distinctly Catholic framework, places enormous emphasis on the death and resurrection of Christ, while leaving the Sabbath question functionally untouched. This allows the resurrection-centered focus to support the broader cultural elevation of Sunday. In Risen, the emphasis on post-resurrection hope and the first day of the week, again, strengthens the emotional centrality of Sunday, while the original sanctity of the seventh-day Sabbath remains absent from the viewer's horizon. Even lighter productions, such as Keeping the Faith and Sister Act, reinforce the emotional warmth, joy, and communal beauty of Sunday-based worship, embedding the idea that Sunday religion is simply normal Christianity. Other films approach religion, prophecy, faith, churches, prayer, and Christian symbolism, while bypassing the biblical Sabbath altogether. This omission is itself significant. In the Left Behind films, attention is directed toward the Antichrist, global crisis, and end-time fear. Yet the Sabbath issue is never allowed to emerge with any doctrinal seriousness. The result is a prophetic framework, detached from one of the central biblical signs of obedience. The Omen films employ dense Catholic imagery, ritual symbolism, and apocalyptic tension, while leaving the Sabbath completely outside the story world. Constantine does something similar, surrounding the viewer with crosses, demons, priests, and spiritual warfare, but never raising the question of which day God actually sanctified. In films such as The Book of Eli, Bruce Almighty, Evan Almighty, and Heaven is for Real, biblical language and Christian imagery are present, yet Sunday Christianity remains the assumed setting. The audience sees churches, prayer, devotion, and divine themes, but not the restoration of the Saturday Sabbath. Through this silence, Sunday remains the unchallenged default, while the true biblical Sabbath is effectively erased by omission. The same conditioning appears in dystopian and science fiction narratives, where society is shown functioning through mandated pauses, collective rituals, or imposed reset cycles. These stories do not openly preach a Sunday law, yet they help prepare the imagination to accept the legitimacy of mandatory rest, structured social rhythm, and the surrender of individual preference for collective order. In The Giver, social harmony depends on a highly regulated system, in which individual freedom is subordinated to imposed stability. In the Purge series, The notion of a scheduled societal release valve reinforces the broader idea that civilization may require officially sanctioned, ritualized interruptions to normal life. In Equilibrium, rigid emotional and behavioral regulation is framed as the price of peace. These narratives help normalize the belief that order, survival, and moral management may require regularly imposed systems of behavioral compliance. Once that logic is accepted, the leap toward a future, mandated day of rest becomes easier for mass audiences to imagine, especially if framed in terms of public good, peace, mental health, or social necessity. Television has perhaps been even more effective than film in normalizing Sunday observance, because television works through weekly repetition and domestic familiarity. Shows such as The Simpsons, Little House on the Prairie, Seventh Heaven, and Touched by an Angel repeatedly portray Sunday church attendance as a normal, an unquestioned part of life. The visual grammar of these programs is simple, but powerful. Families dress for church on Sunday. Communities gather on Sunday. Moral lessons are framed around Sunday, and worship is attached to the first day of the week, as though this were an uncontested Christian inheritance. Rarely is the audience invited to consider that the biblical Sabbath is the seventh day, or that the historic shift from Saturday to Sunday was not established by Scripture in the plain way most viewers assume. Religious broadcasters and media ministries reinforce the same pattern. Figures and networks operating in the mainstream Christian space present Sunday worship as standard, unquestioned, and spiritually legitimate, ensuring that generations of viewers absorb Sunday Christianity, not as a doctrinal controversy, but as the ordinary fabric of religious life. Even dramatizations of Jesus' life, such as The Chosen, operate within a broader Christian media ecosystem, in which Sunday tradition remains culturally dominant, and the Sabbath question is softened or sidelined. A further layer appears in films centered on global crisis, environmental catastrophe, pandemic fear, and humanity-wide emergencies. These stories condition audiences to accept the idea that extraordinary circumstances require universal mandates, collective sacrifice, and the temporary suspension of ordinary liberties for the survival of the whole. In 2012, The Day After Tomorrow, and Don't Look Up, the message is clear. Global threats demand global responses, and resistance to coordinated action is framed as ignorance, selfishness, or irresponsibility. In Contagion and World War Z, mass fear and social breakdown justify emergency controls, collective obedience, and top-down intervention for the sake of human preservation. These films do not explicitly advocate a Sunday law, but they create a mental and emotional environment in which the public becomes more receptive to the idea that a universal rest day, imposed for the sake of the planet, public order, or human survival, could be presented as reasonable and morally necessary once audiences are repeatedly trained to accept global coordination, mandatory compliance, and the subordination of private conviction to collective emergency. The ideological groundwork for an enforced Sunday rest framework becomes easier to lay. Taken together, these patterns reveal how film and television can reinforce Sunday observance without ever making a direct theological argument. Some productions glorify Sunday as sacred, restful, joyful, or virtuous. Others depict religion, while quietly bypassing the Saturday Sabbath. Still others normalize systems of mandated pause, reset, and compliance, preparing audiences to accept future rest day enforcement. under secular justifications, through repetition, omission, symbolism, and emotional framing. Hollywood and television have helped shape a world in which Sunday is treated as the natural day of worship, and Saturday Sabbath-keeping is rendered strange, invisible, or irrelevant. The strength of this conditioning lies precisely in its subtlety. No single film needs to command Sunday observance outright. The broader cultural machinery does the work, gradually, until Sunday feels self-evident, and the true biblical Sabbath becomes something most viewers never seriously consider. Chapter 7. The Jesuit Influence on Hollywood's Key Figures, Shaping Cinematic Narratives. The influence of the Jesuit tradition extends far beyond formal theology and education. It reaches into the realm of cinema, storytelling, and the formation of cultural narratives that shape how millions of people understand morality, authority, sacrifice, redemption, and social order. In Hollywood, this influence is not always explicit, nor does it require direct institutional control to be effective. It can operate through education, cultural formation, intellectual atmosphere, and the transmission of habits of thought that enter the creative process through writers, directors, producers, and actors who have passed through Jesuit schools, absorbed Catholic moral frameworks, or worked within traditions shaped by Jesuit modes of persuasion. The result is not necessarily a coordinated conspiracy, but a recurring pattern in which some of Hollywood's most influential works reflect themes long associated with Jesuit philosophy. Themes of inner conflict, discipline, obedience, suffering, moral ambiguity, elite guidance, and the shaping of society through narrative. Few filmmakers embody this pattern more clearly than Martin Scorsese. Raised in a deeply Catholic environment and educated at Cardinal Hayes High School, Scorsese developed a cinematic language saturated with spiritual tension, guilt, conscience, sin, and redemption. His films repeatedly return to the drama of the divided soul, the burden of moral compromise, and the uneasy relationship between outward action and inward guilt. In silence, the Jesuit connection becomes direct and unmistakable as the film centers on Jesuit missionaries in Japan, presenting them through a framework of endurance, sacrifice, spiritual testing, and fidelity under persecution. In The Last Temptation of Christ, Scorsese explores the agony of doubt, desire, mission, and surrender, all of which resonate with a form of religious introspection that is deeply familiar to Catholic and particularly Jesuit-inflected spirituality. Even in films that are not overtly religious, such as Mean Streets and The Irishman, the moral universe remains profoundly shaped by Catholic categories: confession, penance, guilt, corruption, and the yearning for absolution. Scorsese may not be a Jesuit, but his work bears the imprint of a world in which Catholic discipline, moral struggle, and spiritual tension remain central to the human story. The case of George Lucas is more indirect, yet no less intriguing. Lucas was not educated in a Jesuit institution, and he has publicly pointed to influences such as Buddhism, Taoism, mythology, and samurai culture in developing Star Wars. Yet the Jedi Order he created bears striking structural and philosophical similarities to the Jesuit order. The Jedi are an elite, highly trained body set apart from the ordinary masses, yet deeply involved in the governance of the wider political order. They are formed through years of discipline, philosophy, restraint, and rigorous submission to a code that demands self-mastery, obedience, and the suppression of disorderly passions. They serve as counselors, diplomats, protectors, and guardians of a larger institutional framework, operating with both moral authority and political influence. Historically, the Jesuits occupied a comparable position within the Catholic world. An intellectual and disciplined order trained in theology, philosophy, rhetoric, diplomacy, and strategic engagement, often advising rulers, intervening in education, shaping policy, and embedding themselves in the moral and political life of nations. The parallel becomes even more striking when one considers the broader historical role of the Jesuits. Like the Jedi, they were seen by admirers as defenders of order, and by critics as powerful operators working behind the scenes. They were a disciplined cadre, bound by loyalty, formation, and a universal mission that transcended local identity. Their strategy of enculturation, adapting their message to local conditions while preserving their deeper objectives, finds a curious reflection in the way the Jedi move through different worlds, cultures, and crises while maintaining the primacy of their code and worldview. Even the theme of suppression has its echo. The historical suppression of the Jesuits in the 18th century, when they were expelled or dissolved in various kingdoms due to their growing influence, finds an unexpected mirror in the destruction of the Jedi Order in Revenge of the Sith. Whether or not Lucas consciously intended such parallels, the resemblance remains difficult to ignore. The Jedi function as a cinematic order of disciplined philosopher guardians whose structure, ethos, and political role resemble the image of the Jesuits more than many casual viewers realize. This possibility of indirect influence becomes more plausible when one considers the intellectual environment surrounding Lucas. He was profoundly influenced by Joseph Campbell, whose ideas about myth, transformation, and the hero's journey helped shape the architecture of Star Wars. Campbell studied at Loyola University Chicago, a Jesuit institution, and though that does not prove a direct line of Jesuit transmission into Lucas's work, it places one of the key mediators of Lucas's worldview within an educational environment long associated with disciplined reflection on meaning, narrative, and the moral formation of culture. Influence does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it travels through atmosphere, pedagogy, intellectual habits, and inherited frameworks that are absorbed and transformed by others. In that sense, the similarities between the Jedi and the Jesuits may reflect not direct imitation, but the persistence of an older model of elite moral formation within modern myth-making. Beyond Scorsese and Lucas, the presence of Jesuit-educated figures in Hollywood further supports the argument that Jesuit modes of thought have had a subtle but real effect on the industry's intellectual and thematic shape. James Gunn, for example, attended St. Louis University, a Jesuit-run institution. His films often combine humor with moral tension, emotional woundedness, redemption arcs, and questions of belonging, self-sacrifice, and purpose. These are not uniquely Jesuit themes, but they sit comfortably within a tradition that prizes moral reflection, human contradiction, and the redemptive potential of flawed individuals. The same pattern can be observed across a wider field of actors, writers, executives, and producers who passed through Jesuit schools and carried with them a formation in rhetoric, philosophy, disciplined reasoning, and a view of narrative as a powerful instrument for shaping hearts and minds. What emerges from all of this is a picture not of direct control, but of deep cultural imprinting. The Jesuits have long understood the power of theater, education, language, and carefully constructed narrative to move societies and condition perception. They mastered persuasion not only through sermons and theological argument, but through drama, visual imagination, performance, and intellectual training. In the modern age, cinema has become one of the most powerful vehicles for precisely that kind of influence. It is therefore not surprising that filmmakers formed by Catholic and Jesuit-adjacent environments would produce works saturated with themes of sacrifice, obedience, guilt, mission, authority, moral ambiguity, and elite stewardship. Whether through direct education, indirect philosophical inheritance, or the broader diffusion of Jesuit sensibilities into Western storytelling, Hollywood has repeatedly generated narratives that resonate with the structures and priorities of the Jesuit imagination. In this light, the recurring patterns in modern cinema become harder to dismiss as coincidence. Scorsese's meditations on suffering and redemption, the Jedi Order's resemblance to a disciplined, religious political elite, and the broader presence of Jesuit-educated creatives within Hollywood all suggest that the industry has been shaped, at least in part, by intellectual traditions long associated with the Society of Jesus. The same order that once used theater, education, and disciplined rhetoric to influence nations now finds its echoes in the scripts, symbols, hierarchies, and moral worlds of contemporary film. The language has changed, the costumes are different, and the stage is now global, but the older methods of shaping thought through compelling narrative remain strikingly familiar. Chapter 8. Kim.com. A threat to the globalist deep state's propaganda machine. Kim.com was not merely a target of copyright enforcement. He represented a structural threat to what can be described as centralized media distribution systems and the broader information control architecture tied to major entertainment industries. His platform, Mega Upload, introduced a parallel distribution model that allowed users to access and share media outside traditional studio-controlled channels. In doing so, it challenged both the economic framework and the distribution monopoly that large studios rely upon to maintain influence over global audiences. The significance of this disruption lies not only in lost revenue potential, but in the weakening of centralized gatekeeping. The traditional entertainment model depends on controlled pipelines, cinema releases, licensed streaming platforms, and regulated broadcasting to ensure that content is both monetized and curated. By contrast, Mega Upload enabled decentralized access, reducing reliance on these systems and creating a pathway through which independent distribution could expand without institutional oversight. This shift carried implications beyond economics. Large-scale media production, particularly within Hollywood, operates with substantial financial backing from major corporate entities, requiring sustained revenue streams to justify continued investment. When those revenue streams are disrupted, the number and scale of productions may contract, altering the volume and reach of globally distributed content. A reduction in centralized production capacity could, in turn, open space for independent creators and alternative narratives, diluting the dominance of established studios in shaping cultural output. Historically, the relationship between entertainment media and state institutions, particularly within the United States, has been documented in various forms, including cooperation between studios and agencies such as the U.S. Department of Defense and intelligence bodies like the Central Intelligence Agency. These relationships have often involved logistical support, script consultation, or access to military assets in exchange for portrayals aligned with institutional interests. Within this context, the influence of large studios extends beyond entertainment into the domain of public perception shaping, where narratives can frame geopolitical events, normalize policy positions, or reinforce cultural assumptions. Against this backdrop, Mega Upload introduced a model that bypassed these established channels. By offering free or low-cost access to media, it undermined the revenue-dependent structure that sustains high-budget productions and their associated distribution networks. The potential long-term effect of such disruption would be a fragmentation of media influence, reducing the capacity of any single system to dominate cultural narratives at scale. In parallel, .com's development of Megabox, a platform intended to allow artists to distribute music directly to consumers, further threatened traditional industry structures. This model challenged the role of record labels as intermediaries, echoing earlier disruptions seen with platforms like Napster, but with a more integrated and scalable approach. The implication was a shift toward creator-controlled distribution, reducing institutional control over both content and monetization. The response to .com's activities involved coordinated legal and enforcement actions across multiple jurisdictions, including cooperation among members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Investigations later revealed that New Zealand's Government Communications Security Bureau conducted surveillance on .com in a manner later deemed unlawful, raising questions about the proportionality and legal basis of the operation. The involvement of agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, alongside industry groups like the Motion Picture Association, reflected the convergence of state enforcement mechanisms and corporate interests in addressing perceived threats to intellectual property systems. The scale of the enforcement action, most notably the heavily armed raid on .com's residence, stood in contrast to the typical handling of copyright cases, indicating that the matter was treated as more than a standard civil or commercial dispute. From an analytical perspective, this suggests that the perceived threat extended beyond financial loss to encompass broader concerns about control over digital distribution infrastructure and its implications for media governance. Within this framework, Kim.com's case can be understood as a focal point in the ongoing tension between centralized control systems and decentralized digital platforms. His platforms did not merely compete with existing services. They introduced a structural alternative capable of scaling globally, challenging both the economic and informational hierarchies embedded in the modern media landscape. As of 2026, Kim.com remains in New Zealand, but his position has narrowed significantly after years of litigation. The decisive shift occurred in 2024, when the New Zealand government formally approved his extradition to the United States, and subsequent legal challenges have largely failed to overturn that decision. By 2025, the courts had rejected his final major attempts to block extradition, leaving only limited procedural avenues remaining. This means the case has effectively moved from a question of whether he can be extradited to when the transfer will be executed, subject to final administrative and logistical steps. What stands out across the entire timeline is the persistent and coordinated pressure from the United States, particularly through the U.S. Department of Justice and diplomatic channels linked to the United States Department of State. The case has been pursued continuously since the 2012 mega upload raid, with sustained legal engagement, repeated filings, and ongoing cooperation with New Zealand authorities. This level of persistence is notable, given the length of the proceedings, reflecting a long-term commitment by U.S. authorities to secure .com's transfer and prosecution, even as the case extended over more than a decade. From an analytical standpoint, the relentlessness of the U.S. pursuit underscores how seriously the case has been treated within the framework of international enforcement of intellectual property and financial crime laws. Rather than diminishing over time, as many cross-border cases do, the effort has remained active, with consistent diplomatic and legal follow-through. The result is a rare example of a prolonged extradition process, where state-level commitment has remained stable across multiple administrations, ultimately bringing the case to the threshold of final enforcement.